Hey guys, welcome to the channel. This is Shadows Techland, hosted by myself, Christopher Corey. So wanted to redo video for plex. Obviously the last video I did didn't have audio, so let's go ahead and fix that. So let's go ahead and get basically right into everything. So you're looking at starting a plex server. I get this question a lot, I hear this discussion a lot, so I thought I would go ahead and basically do my own video. So before we can basically get into plex itself, let's go ahead and go over information that you'll need to know to basically start your own plex. So a few things that you need to basically look at. Either A, do you have the hardware already? And if you don't, you need to be asking yourself these questions. So what kind of applications are going to be connecting to your plex server? So is it going to be Android? Is it going to be Windows PC, Linux PC, Plex media player, Roku, or using a streaming stick, smart TV, etc.? Those clients will determine basically how your media is going to be handled and in what type, and we will go over that here shortly. The next question that you need to ask is how many applications and clients, streaming devices, etc. are going to be accessing your content at the same time. The next thing that you need to ask regarding question number 2 is how many, is it going to be local or is it going to be remote? If you're looking at doing just local only and you're not sharing with friends, family member, anything of that nature, and you don't have that many clients, your hardware requirements are going to be tremendously less. When you are looking at doing remotely or a combination of local and remote, once again, your hardware requirements change and you have a lot more things to consider. Also, does your content have any subtitles? Are you looking at foreign languages, things of that nature? Because once again, the more that you add into it, the more requirements that you are going to need. So if you were doing just local, or if you're doing remote or a combination, then you need to start looking at hardware. So the hardware that you're going to be looking at is what CPU do I need? What hard drive space do I need? How much content do I have? What is the quality of my content? Is my content really small, like 480p? Or is it 720? Is it 1080p? Is it 4K? The higher you go up in the quality and the bitrate of the show, the more requirements hardware-wise that you are going to need to stream said hardware to whatever that device may possibly be. So you might ask, what do you need? Well, let's go over those requirements. Well, before actually we go over those requirements, the next thing you need to be asking yourself is, what clients am I using? Depending on what clients you're using will determine 2 types of streaming. And the first one being direct play or transcoding. What direct play basically means is that you have a movie, let's use The Avengers, just throwing a movie out there, and it is a 720p version, and your client has the capability to use 720. Let's say it's a Roku streaming device. Usually those are pretty good codec wise, so usually you can do direct play. Direct play basically means that it's a 1-to-1, so it streams from the server directly to the streaming device, 1-to-1, back and forth, without having to change the quality for the video to work. Now, by chance, if you have a, let's say, less powerful server, or you have a really powerful movie and the client doesn't have the snuff to, the horsepower to basically play, let's use the same example, Avengers at 720p, and your client can only do, let's say, 480. Or vice versa, let's say you have a 1080p version, but your client only does 720. So it needs to take the movie that you have, whatever that quality is, and it has to downgrade it, so basically it re-encodes it on the fly to whatever version of quality that the client can actually use. Now, transcoding will require more power because it has to change that video quality, type, bitrate, etc. for the client to be able to play it correctly. Well, regarding transcoding, let's go over the requirements of hardware that you will need. And this information is based off of the Plex website itself. I will link that description below once I upload this video. So let's go ahead and take a look at everything. So as an example, they have here for a CPU requirement, no transcoding whatsoever, based off of an ARM processor like a NAS, Atom processor. Usually they're like low-end i3, i5 maybe, or they're Atom-based processors. You don't need a lot of quality at that point in time because, again, you're probably just looking at direct and you don't have a huge quality movie, nothing too crazy. Now, when you're looking at 720p, their recommendation for transcoding is a Core i3 3 GHz processor. When you're looking at a single 1080p transcode, they're recommending a Core i5 3 GHz processor. Now, well, things start to get a little crazy requirement-wise when you were looking at doing 4K, 4K UHD, HDR, etc. That's where the requirements get tremendously higher, because it's such a higher quality and it's a higher bit rate, therefore more hardware is needed. For a single 4K transcode, they're recommending an Intel Core i7 3.2 GHz processor. So, basic guidelines, real rough. These numbers aren't, like set in stone. This is just a real basic, rough estimate of what they recommend that you go by. Obviously, your budget will determine what it is that you're doing. So, very roughly, for a single full transcode of a video, the following passmark score requirement is recommended for the following sources. Passmark, you can look up the CPU. So as an example, if you look like an i7 4790, whatever the case your CPU is, just go ahead and put that into Google, put passmark behind it, it'll pull up the passmark for your score. That passmark will determine a rough guideline of what it is that you're looking at, and based off of that, with these following guidelines will give you a rough idea of what your CPU is capable of. And keep in mind, this is just straight CPU. So 720p, 4 megahertz, using H.264 codec, they're recommending roughly about a 1500 passmark score. You go up to a 1080p, 10 megabits per second bitrate, and then H.264, they're recommending roughly about 2000 for the passmark. If you were wanting to do 4K SDR, that's roughly about 40 megahertz of 40 megabytes per second, 8-bit HEVC, 12,000 bit passmark score. That's roughly the equivalent of being transcoded to a 10 megabyte 1080p. Now, things get a lot more crazy when you're looking at going 4K HDR, when you have one of those really super nice 4K televisions that are a lot newer that can do that technology. At that point, you're looking at a 17,000 passmark score. So to give you a rough idea, let's just look up a couple CPUs. I'm just going to pick a couple. So, let's see, i7 4790. Pretty powerful CPU. A lot of people are still using it. Let's take a look at what it is. I'll look that up real quick. Let's see here. Uh, 4790K is roughly, I'm having trouble finding it. One sec here, guys. $8,166 is what that is. So if you go back to their rough guidelines being, let's just call it 7,000, that could do roughly 3 to 4 1080p streams locally, and then transcoding. One of the things you'd have to keep in mind is your bandwidth for your upload speed as well, so you have to take a look at that. So moving on, a couple things to consider. So CPU, what your quality is of your movies. So are they 480p, are they 720p, 1080p, 4K? What codec are you using? Are they H.264 or are they 265? 265, you will definitely get more hard drive space back, but do keep in mind you are doing some compression. So depending on what your needs and how much quality do you want, compressed, uncompressed, that's something you'll have to consider. Obviously, the next thing that you'll have to consider at that point is how much space that you'll need for said content. So I started with, a couple terabytes of space for movies, and now I've basically got quite the extensive library, to put it mildly, at this point. Once again, if you're doing locally, one of the things you'll also want to consider is you'll want to make sure that you have the correct wiring, so you'll want Cat 5, Cat 6 if you can. Obviously, the better category that you go, the more bandwidth that you can get, and you also want to make sure you have a pretty decent switch. Locally, obviously, your content and your requirements will be a lot less when you're looking at doing remotely, like sharing with friends, family members, things of that nature. The next big thing that you'll have to consider is network. So do you have the correct cabling? Do you have a decent switch? Or are you looking at some cheapy $50 switch you might need to possibly upgrade depending on how many clients that you have? The next biggest thing that you'll also have to consider is ISP and your upload speed. Are you, 20 meg down? Are you less? Are you out in the middle of nowhere getting 5 meg a second? You're probably not going to get really too far with transcoding. Also, once again, one of the things to consider when you are streaming and sharing with friends and family members is the clients themselves. And the client would mean the client on the other end. So Sally over in back east, wherever the case may be, other side of the world, who knows what client Sally's using. If Sally's doing a lot of transcoding, then obviously your requirements are higher and you need to build from there. I started with i7 3000 series, 4000 series. Obviously, as my community and sharing grew, my hardware requirements got higher. I then moved to a dual Xeon setup, a dual Opteron setup, using ESXi and passing through storage that way. And then my needs have gotten tremendously bigger at that point in time. So let's basically wrap this up. We've gone over a lot of information. So looking at building a server, first thing you need to decide is how much budget do you have? How much content do you have? The quality that you have. Are you doing local? Are you doing remote? Or are you doing a combination of local and remote? Also keep in mind when you are building your server, if you haven't built it yet, make sure that you look up the CPU passmark score and basically confirm that that passmark score is going to be powerful enough for your needs. Everyone's mileage will vary, obviously, depending on their scenario. Definitely keep that in mind. Make sure that you have obviously adequate space for your needs for your media. And then, once again, make sure that you are building this based off of whatever your needs are. If you're doing it locally and you're only sharing with a couple people, you could get away with a low-end system, probably a laptop, something of that nature. I bet you probably have something laying around that you could probably use. Otherwise, you could build something pretty cheap. Obviously, as your storage and as your media processing power needs get higher, then you need to be looking at something a little bit bigger. Maybe you can do an i7, maybe you have to go to a dual Xeon at that point. Basically, once again, go back to this guide. I'll link it in the description once again, and use that as a rough guideline for building your server and for your needs, and especially your budget. Make sure you stay within that. Definitely, I hope that this helps you guys out. And if you have any other further questions or want to discuss this further, definitely feel free to reach me on social media. I definitely am active in social media, and I have Discord that you can reach me at. Also, I do have other guides that are out there as well regarding GPU transcoding and how that works with Unraid. So definitely check that out. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks, guys.